This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 322 of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast, and I'm again here in Portland, Oregon, for a podcast I've been actually wanting to do for a couple of years now. My guest is Nat West of Reverend Nat Cider. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello,
Nat.
Thanks for having me.
Funny story about this one. I met Nat where we met in the most interesting and unusual of places.
Right.
It was a couple, like 2 years ago, I was mountain biking in Moab. I was just out there in Moab with family vacation with my wife and my kids. They do not mountain bike very much. And so I signed up for a shuttle to go ride the portion of the whole enchilada trail that was still open at that time. It was still early in the
Classic
year.
mountain biking ride in Moab.
Just a big, I've done the full thing before.
Yep.
You know, we can only go so far. Anyway, hop on this shuttle ride, and as it is, you just, they anyone who signs up for the shuttle at that time from whichever of the bike shops, they just throw you all in together. Somebody drives you, everybody up there. Well, we're driving up.
There's only three people on the shuttle.
3 people in the shuttle. Adam was the other one.
Yep.
Nat, and then me. We didn't know each other at the time. We start just chit chatting. Oh, what do you do? It's like, I work in the beer industry. It's like, oh, what do you do?
I'm in the beer industry too. And then Adam, my buddy who I came with, he owns a beer bottle shop as well. So we're all. And then I remember you go, are you Reverend Nat? And I'm like, as a matter of fact, I am. So we had a great time on that ride, and we stayed in touch ever since.
It's been a fun. We spent the rest of the day riding the bottom part of a whole enchilada trail or Porcupine Rim. And
we all came, 10 toes, 10 fingers, no flat tires. So
it was a successful ride and a lot of fun, and it was much better than me riding it by myself. So
absolutely. Awesome.
Here we
fun.
are. And so, since then, I was like, I should definitely do a podcast with Nat whenever it's convenient. And then it was last week where you're like, the news came out, like, Reverend Nat's is going to wind down business.
You're running out of time. You got to get it.
And then so I was like, okay, I happen to be coming to Portland. Let's make this happen.
Of course.
And here we are to capture Reverend Nat's approach to cider making, beer-influenced, beer-inspired approach to cider making.
Yes.
And that's what we're going to talk about here in this episode, that beer-ish approach to cider making. Before we do that, G&D Chillers, the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, are proud of the cool partnerships they've built over the past 30 years. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. Want to maximize efficiency in your chiller? G&D's micro-channel condensers are designed for less power draw. Their lighter weight and more compact design uses up to 70% less refrigerant, which means a lower GWP and lower operating costs. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com or call to discuss your next project. Also, support for this episode comes from BSG, looking for a sustainable way to increase fermenter capacity. Try FermCap Eco from Kerry. Developed as a part of Kerry's Eco Brewing range, FermCap Eco is a plant-based alternative to traditional silicon-based products. FermCap Eco increases fermenter capacity by reducing foam height to improve beer foam stability and enhance hop utilization. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact your BSG sales rep to get started. And as your brewery making its own ciders, seltzers, and other beverages beyond beer, if you need a central source for fruit flavor, Old Orchard has you covered. Old Orchard supplies flavored craft juice concentrate blends to beverage brands for the production of beer, cider, seltzer, wine, spirits, kombucha, and more. Flavor your lineup and streamline your sourcing by heading on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. Now, we normally kick things off with some background, so why don't you talk to us about yours? What took you down this road? How'd you end up here? What made you decide to start a cidery?
Well, this business has been around for 12 years now. I started the business in my basement, actually at home, in 2012. I had the idea in 2011. I was sitting around the table drinking some homemade cider that I had made. I've been making cider for a few years prior to starting the business, and some of my neighbors were there. We were having dinner and beers, and they were home brewers, and I was making cider. And I remember this night very clearly. We sat around my big kitchen table, and I had some cider that I'd made from a an orchard that grew really great apples, cider-specific apples, and we were all drinking this cider and really enjoying it. And somebody brought out a bottle of a commercially produced cider, and I happen to know that cider was made using the same apples from the same orchard. So I had a commercially produced version and my home version, and you can guess what happened next. Everyone loved mine and hated that one. They're no longer in business, but neither am I. So anyway, but we that was my real impetus to for the sake of the apple. This was a fantastic orchard with growing fantastic fruit, and I felt like this cider maker wasn't really doing the best job that he could have done with this fruit. So I kind of did it for the fruit, for the good of the fruit. I started the business in my basement.
You thought there was a better flavor opportunity. I mean, which is really the story of craft beer, right?
Yeah. And I mean, one of our early taglines is the apple's deepest purpose realized. And I have this sort of mind game that I play with myself. Imagine you're an apple and you're hanging on a tree, and you lean over and talk to your other apple buddy, and you're like, "Hey, what are you going to be when you grow up?" "Oh, I'm going to be in a kid's lunchbox, and he's probably going to throw me away." Oh no, I'm going to be hard cider and get somebody drunk. Like I think that would be, if I was an apple, that's what I want to be turned into, is to turn into alcohol. So it was really
you're going for the party apples.
It really, yeah. Woo, yeah. So that was kind of my mission. There was just to make really good cider and approach it from a beer angle. And that's not, I'm not saying that just because this is a beer podcast. I've always brought my beer background and beer appreciation to my cider making, even from the very earliest days.
Sure. So, talk to me about getting started. How did that start influencing what products you wanted to make?
Right.
Because your approach to cider making is a little unconventional relative to the mainstream of the cider world.
Totally. So, I mean, in the beginning, there was two different steps. One is getting juice out of apples. I was starting with whole apples. And that's a relatively Googleable question. It's not an art to getting juice out of apples. It's more of a science. Squeeze them hard, basically.
Yeah.
But I had this juice.
There's plenty of processing background information around that.
And there's not a lot of you just go for the maximum yield and the quickest turnaround. That's kind of it, right? But then you have this juice, or in the case of beer making, you'd have sweet wort, and you don't know what yeast to put in there. You don't know what temperature to ferment it at. You don't know how long, or what other ingredients potentially to add. And so I reached out to my home brewer friends that were sitting around the table with me, and I was like, "Hey, what should I use for this this cider?" And one of the guys was like, "Hey, I have this Saison yeast packet. It's a little bit old. You should just throw that in." So I did, and it was incredible. And then only after I made a few batches of cider did I go back and buy cider books, how-to cider books, and then go to the homebrew store. And I was having these, the books and the homebrew store advice was the opposite of what I had been doing. The first cider that I ever had was my own. I didn't know what cider was supposed to taste like. Yeah. So I think that was really the kernel.
Saison yeast and no yeast nutrient, and you just made cider that way.
And I put hops in the second cider I ever made.
Oh, hey.
So it was really approaching it from a homebrewer's perspective, but also 99% of what I drink is beer. I'm a beer drinker and a cider maker. So I have a lot of beer knowledge, and
just like all the winemakers, I mean, really,
it's a lot of beer to make good wine. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I've always brought my love of beer into it, and always tried to make cider for beer drinkers specifically. And so, hops is an obvious one. Beer yeast is an obvious one. And there's a lot of process that we do that's more familiar to a brewery than it would be in like a winery, for instance.
There's also the question that you have, which is, where to get, not just how to press those apples, but how to get characterful apple, juice.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Which is probably, an issue that cider makers, as cider is growing more developed now in the United States, more and more, a lot of those heirloom apples are not planted in the kind of quantity that cider makers want.
Yeah,
I mean, how do you parse that one out? Is that not as a big focus?
That was like the thing in the mid 2010s. That was like the story of American cider was we can't get enough good apples, and that was a lie, really, because cider
hot take. I love it.
Bring it on. Cider is a regional drink wherever it's made around the world, and cider makers around the world make cider using fruit that's grown in their neighborhood, in their region, in their state or province or county or whatever, and they ferment it using yeast and other techniques that are endemic in their environment, and they make it for the local drinkers to drink. So cider that's made in the West Country of England, it tastes that way for a reason, versus cider that's made in like Dorset tastes different for a reason. And Northern France is different from Southern France and Spain, and Asturias and Basque Country taste different. And the Pacific Northwest is its own a kind of food culture and beer culture. So I make cider. I always approach cider making as for a regional audience, and we grow the best eating apples in the world in the Pacific Northwest. The Washington State grows more apples than the rest of the U.S. combined, and the United States of America grows the second largest producer of apples in the world after China. The vast majority of China's crop goes to concentrate. So Washington State grows the eating apples for the world, basically. So we have access to extremely high quality, very low priced apples, 365 days a year. So those are the apples that I'm going to use. We eat salmon in the Pacific Northwest because it grows. We catch it here, it grows here. So for the same reason, I'm using these commodity grocery store apples like Granny Smith, Gala, Golden Delicious, Pink Lady, Fuji, things like that. So the question for me wasn't like, oh, I can't get the good apples. The question for me was, I have this agricultural product here that is the best in the world, and it produces alcohol. What am I going to do to make it delicious and more representative of the area that we live in? So, Portland is the best beer city in the world. I still think that Portland is the best beer city in the world. Maybe not the biggest or whatever, but the most diverse and most interesting. So it makes a lot of sense for the kinds of ciders that I would make, if I want them to be representative of Pacific Northwest, to have a strong beer influence in them.
I have to remain more political in my my approach to that, but I will acknowledge that yes, Portland is one of the great beer cities.
I'll take one of.
It is one of the great beer cities. I love Portland, and the brewers that this city has produced and continues to produce are really just some of the best in the world.
Certainly world class.
Which is why I've been spending this last week working with some of them to build video classes for our All Access program.
Excellent.
But that's an aside. Let's talk about how you went about creating what you say you've done, which is building cider that's geared towards this Portland idea of ingredients, but also what drinkers want out of that, and what form that took, and then some of the technical process that went into that. Before we do that, take your brewing to the next level with AccuBrew's revolutionary fermentation monitoring system, now predicting specific gravity. AccuBrew's mobile app and stainless steel sensor work together to send you live data from inside your tanks, including predicted gravity, fermentation activity, clarity, and temperature. Unlike other fermentation monitoring systems, AccuBrew is CIP ready and designed to stay out of your way, saving you time and space. Their set it and forget it solution streamlines systems and processes, helps maintain consistency, and detects problems before they ruin a batch. Join the AccuBrew community today and experience 24/7 peace of mind. Also, ProBrew is excited to announce that they are currently featuring short lead times. That's between 2 and 4 weeks for their in-stock ProFill rotary can fillers. These can fillers run at speeds between 100 and 600 cans per minute while achieving precise and consistent filling volumes not achievable by most inline and mobile fillers. For more information, fill out their contact form at www.probrew.com or email contactus@probrew.com to learn exactly how they can take your operations to the next level. ProBrew, brew your beer. And if you're in the area, I'll be up there at the ProBrew Oktoberfest gathering in October. And so in Waukesha, Wisconsin, come join us. Nat, let's talk about where the rubber meets the road. You start Reverend Nat's with this goal to make cider for the Pacific Northwest and to do it with this, with local apples or regionally grown apples that are close by, and marrying that to the kind of flavor and innovation that craft brewers would expect.
Right.
What form did that start to take? What became some of the key products? And then let's start talking about how you've honed those key products over the years.
Yes, I mentioned earlier the second cider I ever made had hops in it. And that extended into the first cider that I ever actually sold was a cider that we no longer make called Hallelujah Hoppercott. And that cider really put us on the map as innovators and as beer-centric cider makers. Apricot hops and apricot. We used Cascade and Amarillo. At the time, this is in 2012, Amarillo was, the hot shit, right? And so we were really fortunate to get into that hop pretty early. And apricot was
also mentioned you're here in Portland. There are hop fields, 45 minutes from here.
Yep.
You've got great access to a lot of great ingredients there.
Exactly. And so, I've had the privilege of being able to, when Crosby came out with their Idaho 7 hop a number of years ago, they gave it to us before it was released and said, hey, can you make a cider with this? Just so we can throw some trademarks on its use in cider. And I was like, sure, before it was released. So that was a really nice thing. So apricot was, Cascade and Amarillo. It was a classic dry hopped. We used, IPA dry hopping volumes and amounts of time. And then we used some apricot juice. And if you for the older brewers in the audience, if you remember back, apricot Hefeweizen was like a thing. Everybody made one back in the day, and so apricot was a very go-to ingredient in the brewing world. So it made sense for me to try it. And we were able to get a lot of the more like the pit of the apricot to come out. The secret was that we actually used 75% peach and 25% apricot. So it's like, but Hopra peach didn't.
They're so close. They're so close.
Yeah. So that cider got us into a famous Pete Brown book called World's Best Ciders. He was paying attention to ciders in 2012 and 2013. He still does. That cider put us on the map as far as like unusualness. I think his quote in the World's Best Ciders book for that one was, "Sounds like it could be a giant mistake, but it was actually really good and represents what happens when you have like a restrained hand in doing the blending." And I think the early success that I had with apricot really made me focus on cider making as a craft, as a process, a bit more like the way a chef would approach making a dish, as opposed to how a winemaker says, "Oh, grow the best grapes and then get out of the way." And that's very much not my approach. My approach is assemble the best ingredients, find the best ingredients from wherever they may be, and then use a variety of processes to blend and to mingle all the flavors together in the right balance, in the right proportions. A winemaker can't overdo the amount of Pinot they put into their Pinot, but any brewer can easily overdo the amount of ingredient X they put into their IPA. My cider making approach is all about really honing in on those nuanced differences between, 5 pounds of hops for 5 days, or 6 pounds for 3 days, or 7 pounds for 3 days, and then 2 pounds for 2 days. Pellets versus whole, cryo, et cetera. We've explored all those things, which is extremely common for brewers. Sure. I'm not saying anything that's unusual from a beer perspective, but cider makers who are listening to this episode, they're going to be like, "What is he talking about?" Because the cider maker's language does not include the same language, the same vocabulary that brewers have.
I know winemakers love to pretend that they do so little with their wine.
Oh,
and I think there's a fair amount of storytelling that goes along with that. And when you see just how involved some of that winemaking gets, maybe a little bit more involved than they want to say.
But that is the storytelling for sure. And I've been very open about embracing the complexity of the process that we go through to make our ciders, and not just things like apricot, but things like tepache, and we've done lactobacillus fermentations, and we've done a variety of like boiled ciders as well, which is very beer reminiscent as well.
You can read Kate Bernat's story on making tepache. It was out earlier this year in Craft Beer and Brewing. Features Nat, and I think there's the recipe along with that too.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
So go to the Craft Beer and Brewing archives and check that out, because you are a subscriber, aren't you? Of course you are. Well, let's talk about when you're building cider, where your goal is also to layer in other flavors. How do you build the foundation for that? In terms of, some mechanics around that, are there some specific apples that you find have the kind of support or substance? Do you change that at all?
Right.
Are there some gravity goals? You go full dry and then sweeten back. Talk to me about some of the framework for building these,
Sure.
So that, because as we all know, like if you are going to layer in these other flavors and are not just looking for that light and crisp thing, then, I shouldn't say these might still be light and crisp, but also
other things.
Building a cider that can stand up to some of these flavors,
right,
is a little different than maybe just going for that pure expression.
Yeah, totally. So I think there's just as much opportunity. I think there's more opportunity for flavor experimentation in cider than there is in beer, because the cider consumer is a little bit more open to whatever ingredient is in there. And there are not just the beer purists. I think the average beer drinker is a little bit hesitant to have raspberry in their beer, let's say. But there's no cider drinker in America who's hesitant to have a raspberry cider. That's just like completely normal.
Those beer drinkers are all in different camps, right? There's the beer drinker that absolutely never wants to have fruit in their beer, and then there's beer drinkers that love fruit in their beer.
Right.
But there's enough of each that it's not everybody. And
you could potentially offend someone, but you're going to offend no cider drinkers by putting raspberry in cider.
You're talking about cider, so we're at a point where fruit is okay.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Like it's automatically okay.
Yeah. So I think but backing up from the question of raspberry, yes or no, there's yeast is a huge contributor.
Yeah.
And if you read the literature, capital T, capital L, on cider making, they'll tell you to use a white wine yeast or a champagne yeast, or even potentially they may say use a cider yeast. But cider yeasts are just repackaged and price increased white wine yeast. It's like the pink tax for women. That's the cider tax for yeast. Don't buy cider yeast, just buy a white wine yeast. But white wine yeasts are known to get out of the way of the fruit, to not add any character. They're supposed to just ferment the sugars in there and leave the essence and the soul of the fruit alone. And as beer makers, beer drinkers, we know that yeast plays a huge role in the flavor and aroma of a beer, and the fermentation mechanics as well, which can then have subsequent flavor and aroma changes. So I use beer yeast. I use liquid beer yeast, and I think that's we were the first cider company to use exclusively liquid beer yeast, or beer yeast in general. Since then, there have been other folks who do use beer yeasts, and they're really playing with a set of colors on there to paint their picture that other cider makers are not. So from my perspective, if I want to make something interesting and unique and complex and layered, why would I not use every tool at my disposal? And yeast is a huge one for me, just as much as it is in beer. The other thing that, going way back early, is also apple selection. There is not as much diversity in commonly available apples as there is in commonly available malts. And any brewer in America can get access to the same malt bill that you would use to make any beer in the world, pretty much. I mean, it might be hard to get some European malts, but you can actually get them, or you can get close clones of them in America. Some of the harder stuff to get, people pay the price to get Maris Otter or whatever, but you can't buy some fruit that you might want to get as a cider maker. There's just not that much diversity in apple. We deal less with apple flavor and aroma than I wish we could. That's not to say there's none. There's a huge difference between a Granny Smith. If you've eaten a Granny Smith apple, bright green, super tart, flavorless, hard, dense. If you've eaten a Granny Smith apple versus a Red Delicious, which is a little bit more flavor, terrible tasting skin, mushy. Anybody can tell the difference between those apples, blind even. If you give somebody a slice of each, sure, they could tell which one's which. So there are differences in apples, and when you get into more exotic types of apple cider specific varieties, you get things like tannins and bitterness and other sort of nutty flavors and aromas, which can come through. But even in the most wildish flavors of apples, most hard to get flavor varieties, I don't think there's as much difference between apples as there is between a super light crystal malt and a burned
600 Lovibond, roasted barley.
Not there. So we're starting off from a little bit smaller of a color palette when we have our base fruit selections, but we have just as much opportunity to do yeasts, and then I think we have even more opportunity to add ingredients that customers are happy to buy.
So what when you're choosing your yeasts, talk to me about the creative process behind that. Are there where you're trying to hit some flavor goals, certain yeasts that will work well?
Sure.
Do you choose different beer yeasts based on what the goal is for that, or what fruit or other ingredient you're adding to it, and then how do you optimize the performance of that yeast in a cider fermentation?
Right. Yeast in cider is a bit of a beer yeast in cider is a brave new world. You can't I can't, as a brewer, a beer maker, you could go to, the yeast catalog and you can read, here's the attenuation levels and here's the fermentation temperature, ideal fermentation temperatures. And this is what happens if you ferment it warm. This is what happens if you ferment it cold. And all these, don't add this fermentation aid, do better with this malt, all this kind of stuff. None of that exists for cider. So you're very much on your own. The way I tend to pick beer yeast, most years I would do yeast trials. So I would go to the homebrew store and I'd say, hey guys, sell me whatever yeast you want. And they would say, oh, you should try this one. I like this one. I've been making beer with this one. And I would come back and just use the same apple juice and make, 1 gallon batches of each and try to find some good yeast that are interesting. That had some success, but mostly what I found success in was drinking a lot of beer and thinking, where is the yeast? How is the yeast contributing to this beer? So I vividly remember the first time I had DuPont Saison, and most of us might remember that time. It's like, where were you when Kurt Cobain died? It's like, where were you the first time you had DuPont Saison? And I was blown away. I remember talking to the bartender, the bottle shop, and I was like, why the hell does it taste like this? And he's like, the yeast. And I was like, give me some of that. So very much like,
it's all the rusticity that they add to it.
They just waft it through the farm before they
add extra rusticity.
Yeah, that's a good word. So using beer knowledge to select yeast is my fundamental, my most important way that I've collected yeasts to use for cider. That being said, the flavors that arise during the fermentation of wort using the DuPont Saison strain are completely different than the flavors and aromas that arise using that strain in apple juice. They are not related at all. We produce esters very, very different in the different part of the flavor wheel or whatever from beer. There isn't even a strong correlation between the volume of flavor produced, how loud that yeast flavor might come out in the cider versus in the beer. But I have found that there are some similarities, like Pilsner yeast don't really get in the way of anything in the beer brewing process, and they really don't contribute anything in the cider making as well. Hefeweizen yeasts are kind of gross they're very strong and pronounced in beer, right? They don't really do anything good in cider. I haven't figured out how to make them do anything good in cider. We use English ale yeast. One of our most popular yeasts that we use is the London ESB Yeast 1968. We use that one a lot. And I started using that one because I was reading some homebrew forum and somebody was like, oh yeah, it produces aldehydes, which can be like green apple aromas. And I was like, give me that. And so we actually baby that yeast to produce extra aldehydes, which layer the apple flavor. And you don't necessarily want that in a beer, but we're abusing that yeast in the fermentation process so that it dumps a ton of aldehydes, which are not offensive in the ciders that we make. So sometimes
they should be there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes I'm using yeasts in ways that they're quote unquote designed to by the manufacturer. Yeah. And sometimes I have lucky breaks and find out things that, if I ferment things super hot, and then I do battle with the sulfur that's produced, I can get some incredible flavors out of it that are not on the scope. I've talked to like the folks at Scott Labs and at Lauvin, and they're like, kind of, they don't understand. They don't want to get involved because they know it's a whole nother world. They're proud of their decades of research in how to use these yeasts in beer, and they don't want me coming along and messing up all their information. But it is a lot of fun coming up with those yeasts. Those you got to use the 1968, the London ESB for the green apple yeast cider that we're making. You don't want to make that for more of the softer rounder because you want those yeast flavors to go towards that cider that you're trying to make. And we use, I think it's called A13 juice, Imperial yeast. Yeah. We use that one for like more of our tropical, where we're literally adding tropical fruit in addition to the cider. So we're layering flavors and aromas both from the yeast and from the ingredients that we're adding.
So this hazy IPA yeast actually works pretty well for making
that's actually one that does translate. It throws off passion fruit and guava and all that crazy stuff that you're not sure if it really throws off in a beer, but it really throws it off in a fructose fermentation. Yeah, interesting.
When you say you stress the London ESB yeast, Is that just a temperature stress, under pitching?
Yeah.
Under nutrient? How?
The under nutrient and temperature. The pitch is they work their way up to however many cells they need to get the job done. But cider, different from beer, we have no nutrients. You have effectively zero nutrients in our juice. So we add fermented K to every fermentation at about 30% sugar depletion. Some people add it in the beginning, some people add it at 50%, some people do both. We've just found that it works for us at 30% depletion, but we've really honed in on the grams, milliliters that we add, so that we can get it to produce some more offensive flavors in a low volume of offensive flavors, to have some background complexity in there.
Offensive being in air quotes of sorts here.
A small amount of diacetyl is okay in certain beer styles, and we want to have like a small amount of aldehydes in certain cider styles,
just to add some extra layers of complexity.
Yeah, layers for it. And so some cider makers may be listening to this and be like, "Oh, just use great apples." Yeah, okay, but we don't grow the great apples here. We grow these more common apples. So this is how I've developed a culture of cider making, by layering flavors, not just relying on the best fruit, but bringing other ingredients and bringing process really to the whole thing as well.
And there's space enough for all of that, right? There is in the same way that there's great whiskeys and there are great botanical spirits that require a nuanced approach to both the base spirit and the herbal blend that goes into it. So can you make something that is just pure apple focused cider, or using apples to create as a base for some beverage that pulls in these other things too.
I mean, I like Ale Apothecary and Coors Light, so it's all good.
Well, I'll forgive you for the latter there.
You're more of a Miller kind of guy?
No, Banquet. I mean, if you're going to go for Coors, it can't be light. It's got to be Banquet. Yeah. I don't hate Banquet. I live in Colorado. It's it's kind of a rite of passage. But let's. I'm curious. Talk to me about the fermentation. What is your typical beer yeast fermentation of cider look like? And then as you're doing this, what are the things that you look out for, pitfalls and trouble spots, and timing, temperature, and those kinds of pieces.
Cider is actually pretty hard to make on a small scale. Home scale, any home brewer with a halfway decent or even pretty bad homebrew setup can make a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale clone. It's not that hard. The recipe is known, and if you follow the steps, you'll get the beer basically to taste the same. It's very hard to make. I pity the fool that tries to make my Revival hard apple at home. I couldn't make it at home on a home scale. It's too complicated. So I'll speak about it from a commercial perspective.
Sure.
And, if you're a home cider maker, good luck. We're bringing in fresh juice.
I love the challenge there.
Yeah.
The challenge is right there.
Ain't going to happen. Don't try it. Try something else with your life. We start off with whole juice. We have the luxury, again, of being in the Pacific Northwest, so we can order up a full tanker, 5,500 gallons or more of fresh juice. And these are apples. This is a juice that was an apple on a Tuesday. It was crushed on a Wednesday and delivered to us on a Thursday. So extremely fresh. We do store apples whole in the Pacific Northwest, so I can buy whole apples. The harvest starts in October or so in earnest, and I can buy on October 1st, I can buy last year's apples, and they're still in good shape, good quality. They've been held well in these
crazy warehouses that are like filled with CO2 so that they can't.
And lots of science.
Yes. Yeah. So they can't oxidize or age. It's.
Yeah. And when they open the door of one of those rooms, that's it. You got to get those apples out and you got to process them right away. So we get these great apples at a really low cost.
People can't walk into those because there's no oxygen in them.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a luxury that we have in the Pacific Northwest, that we have these great apples available to us. So we don't press apples. I press pineapples, which maybe we can talk about, but I press pineapples, but not apples anymore. I press some specialty apples if there are small growers in the area that have really cool varieties. I'll bust out the press for that. But we're primarily bringing in fresh juice. The bricks or Play-Doh gravity target is specified by us to the juice processor. So they're going to be blending different varieties of apples to get to our bricks target. The pH and TA, we actually look at TA a lot more than pH, TA being total acidity or titratable acidity. Yeah, so we prefer that one because that's what humans taste. Humans don't taste pH, they taste TA. And it's not a linear number linear relationship between the two numbers. So we spec TA and we spec a pH range. We don't really care about that pH. But anyway, the juice shows up.
The TA is consistent, or do you change it?
It's a little bit of a range. Okay. And the range gets challenging to meet that range as the season progresses because apples in storage lose acidity. So Granny Smith is the most commonly available high acid apple, and Granny Smith price goes up and up and up throughout the season because if you want to make a consistent product year round, you need to add more and more Granny Smith or malic acid, powdered malic acid, which is fine, but powdered malic acid has a different taste to it than the same TA Granny Smith juice does. So you got to be a little careful with your blending there. But anyway, the juice comes to us within our chemistry specs and big old tanker, and we pump it in with a huge pump and put it into our big fermenters. Cider makers tend to operate on a larger scale than an equal-sized brewery. So my tanks are 85-barrel tanks, and 85 barrels, some brewers are going to be like, whoo, that's big. But we're making like 7,000 or 8,000 barrels a year. It's pretty big, but not huge necessarily, because that's how big the tankers are. The tankers are big. So when they come, you want to be able to put them in all at once. So, and it goes in.
You also don't have to have a brew house here. So,
zero brew house. Yeah. Yo. Yeah, nothing hot, which is nice. So then we're adding, we add a pectic enzyme, pectinase, which helps break down the pectin in the juice, which really aids our fermentation or our filtration process later on. Not necessary, but it's good for us. And then we pitch yeast. We usually pitch the same day, and we tend to underpitch because I'm a cheap bastard. And sometimes we'll build a starter. We'll get an underpitch in the day before, and if I have some fresh juice previously,
you're also talking about this build it up. Massively fermentable thing. That you have
it's just sugar ready to go.
Right.
Yeah. And we don't do any oxygenation. The juicing process keeps all the oxygen in there, or more accurately, there's no boiling process to blast off the oxygen. Right. So there's no oxygen in the building. So no cider maker knows the word oxygen. And so we pitch liquid yeast, and the fermentation dynamics are largely similar to beer at that point as far as the timeline, the temperature goes. The temperature is an art, so I can't really give you too much information there. But other than try your own thing, see what happens. Fermentation happens in 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 days, depending on how well we hit the temperatures. It's very similar to beer, a little bit faster.
Or jacketed glycol tanks?
Okay. We do not use cones on the bottom because we do not repitch. We do not harvest and repitch, which is a cost. It's a frustratingly high cost. But the fermentation...
For a cheap bastard like you.
Yeah, exactly. It annoys the hell out of me. But we can't get... fermentation is really... fructose fermentations are really hard on yeast. They just go for broke, and they have nothing left in their little tiny gas tanks when they're done. And so I'm not aware of any cider makers in America that consistently repitch yeast, harvest and repitch. So I think that cones are not necessary. It's just waste of space, right? So we dish, we ferment at about 30% sugar depletion. I mentioned this. We add for Meg K, and how much you add, that's art as well. We'll do a little pump over as well. On a big tank, I think it's just fairly common in the brewing world as well. If you have a huge tank, very tall, very big, very massive, doing a pump over is good to add some oxygen to stir up the yeast. The yeast can get a little bit tired and sit to the bottom. So we'll do a pump over.
Maybe some little bit of temperature stratification within the tank too.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you open the top of an 85-barrel tank while it's fermenting, the thing is rolling. There's just a huge amount of temperature stratification. Yeah. That means hot moving up and cool moving down.
Convective currents through the tank.
Yeah, especially if you have a jacket on as well. Everything on the sides just drops. So, and the fermentation completes. The thing about the one takeaway, if you're thinking about making cider and you come from a beer background, is that all ciders will always go to 0.998 or 0 bricks. They will not stop above. You need to make sure that you're planning for them to go to 0 bricks. If it's stuck at 1.5 brick or 1.5 Plato and you're like, oh, it's done. It's not done. It will keep going. Every speck of sugar in juice is completely fermentable. It's 99.9% fructose and a little bit of glucose. And there's no complex sugars, so it'll just go all the way. So our fermentations finish, and we aim for a real straight line fermentation chart. We don't like to have that lag at the bottom. So our pump overs can get a little more aggressive as the last day or two kick in. And then for us, we run these, there's no diacetyl rest. We just go. When it hits terminal, you're done, you're ready to fly. The only reason why we might put a little bit of rest is there's going to be a ton of residual CO2 dissolved in the liquid at that point, which can make further processing a little bit of a pain in the ass because we go right into a filter, and our filter doesn't like CO2 in suspension in the liquid. So we might give it a 24 or 48 hour time just to kick off some of the CO2 in solution. And then we run through a crossflow, and this is where things start getting a little non-brewer. Our crossflow filter is primarily a wine technology. Most wineries use crossflow technology. It is wild. It's an hour-long podcast by itself, so maybe I'll just put a pin in that, and you can Wikipedia crossflow if you want. It's extremely expensive, but the takeaways are there's no consumable filter media, so I don't pay per run. I buy $10,000 modules every 6 or 10 years. And they run in a single pass from milkshake, just hit terminal, to crystal clear 0.2 microns in a single pass. There's no adjustability to the output. I can't say, I want a little bit of a haze at all. And 0.2 micron is actually nominally sterile. So we have a very, very, very clean product coming out of our fermenters and through our crossflow filter. From there, it goes right into our bright tanks, and our bright tanks are normal beer bright tanks, jacketed, it's got cladding on it, insulation, and then we do blending. So we might blend 50% of this juice yeast ferment with 50% of that juice yeast ferment. We might... or 70-80 or whatever, so 70-20, 70-30, God, math, I'm an old man. We're going to be adding other ingredients at that point. So if I'm making my pineapple cider, it's getting fresh pineapple juice put into the bright tank. We're going to be dry hopping. We're going to be adding spices. We're going to be making teas in other small kettles and pouring the teas in. Whatever blending happens in the bright tank. And then we go to package. And then the packaging is the same as it is for beer, kegs, cans. The next step is crucial for us. We pasteurize all of our cans and bottles, and that is to prevent any further re-fermentation because, again, ciders always want to go to zero. So if you add back any sugars at all, so fresh pineapple juice, for instance,
right,
that will want to ferment. Theoretically, in some sterile environment, you could keep all the yeast out. But the least sterile environment known to humanity is a brewery. So the concept, we're not hubristic enough to think that we could make a completely clean product. So we always
no matter how good your crossflow filter is.
Yeah, we're not cheesemakers here. So we pasteurize all of our cans and bottles, and that effectively gives forever shelf life stability from a microbiological perspective, not necessarily from a flavor perspective. Well,
I want to talk a little bit about your creative process about building flavors. What you found does work, what doesn't work, but just how you approach these things, where you find inspiration, how you source these other ingredients beyond apples, and find compelling blends of them. Before we do that, you like wildly aromatic IPAs and tropical lagers? Good thing Omega designed dialyzed yeast for just that reason. Dialyzed yeast are a new tool for brewers to bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your malts and hops. And wait, there's more. Omega yeast makes yeast to order with a consistent 1-week lead time, ensuring peak freshness and reliability. Also, sustainability doesn't have to cost you more. Try Robert's Polypros multi-pack can handles designed for sustainability and cost savings. Grip pack rings are biodegradable and average 5 cents per unit. Craft pack carriers are recyclable and designed with 30% less plastic. Plus, you can save up to 25% on costs. Enjoy easy application with inline applicators and 24/7 support. It's easy to go green with these multi-pack handles. Visit go.robertspolypro.com/cbbpod to request free samples and start saving today. And ABS Commercial has been a full-service brewery outfitter for 10 years. They are proud to offer brew houses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts to brewers across the country, as well as equipment for distilling, cider making, wine making, and more. They know the ins and outs of the brewing and installation process and can design the perfect setup for you, whether you're just starting out or looking to expand. Contact them today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your customized brewery needs. ABS Commercial, we are brewers. So, you've mentioned some of the brands like, the Apricot, and talk to me about the flavor inspiration that you find. How you have found hop blends that work well in cider. Again, you've got all the hops that you want right here at your disposal.
Yeah.
Where you find other fruits, and what you have found complement your cider as well.
Sure.
And then, how those then end up finding their way into and expressing properly through the cider.
I think it's a good way that I like to think about that is the same way that brewers might think about their entire portfolio. You're gonna have to be a fairly prolific brewery to make an Italian Pilsner, a French Pilsner, a Czech Pilsner, and so most people are going to have maybe one or two light.
Or you just are just notch brewing and
exactly
you just make it all right.
It's all good, right? So my goal, I'm a business owner as well, so it's like let's make sure that I have a cider for every drinking occasion. I think there's a beer for every drinking occasion, and until Reverend Nats came along, I didn't feel like there was necessarily a cider for every drinking occasion. So
there was a cider for the person that didn't want to order the beer.
There was one. Thanks. Yeah. What do you have on tap? Yeah, it's a cider. I think it's an apple cider. Actually, it's a sidebar here. I hate this so much. There's a thing, on the menu, you go in and, cider, what do you have? Oh, it's a Reverend Nat's rotating. And you're like, okay, which one is it? And they're like, it's the rotating one. I don't know. And I got so pissed off. This is like happens everywhere, right? It's just like, we just have a cider on tap. I don't know what it is. So actually, I literally made a cider called Rotating Seasonal. That's the name of the cider, which I thought was like funny as shit. I mean, I was like, it was a drunk moment, right?
Sure.
So I had this drunk moment. I was in this bar. I texted my distributor guy, my distributor brand manager. I was like, hey, will you guys hate me if I make a cider called Rotating Seasonal? He's like, yeah, but you can go ahead and do it anyway. And nobody got the joke. It was such a nightmare. My sales team hated me. The bars hated me. Every social media DM was like, what's the Rotating Seasonal? I'm like, it's called Rotating Seasonal. Yeah, so we don't get the
That's like naming your bar the library. You know, it's like, I'm going to the library. It's like, that's really funny. Okay, whatever.
There's a beer bar in town called Beer, BEER. It's impossible to Google Beer Portland because you'll never find the place.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think, going back to your question, the point is to try to make ciders that are diverse from each other, far enough away from each other that you can make a choice about which one you want rather than feel stuck between a couple. So there's seasonality to it. Do I want something maybe that would go good warmed up? Ciders can go well warmed up, unlike most beers, for the winter time. Something that's can hold up to a really heavy dinner that you might eat in the winter. What would a spring cider look like? Well, it'd be bright and fresh, but again, not too sweet. I don't make really anything really sweet. What is a summer cider like? Well, there's a lot of summer drinking occasions. There's like going to the park and have a picnic. There's sitting on a front porch. There's lawnmower ciders, lawnmower beers. There's mountain biking beers, which I have ciders, which I've got one because I sponsor a lot of mountain biking events and I ride a lot. And I always wondered, what is that one thing that I want after a ride? So I made one just for that moment. Then there's more of like the fall seasonal where you start to feel like, maybe fresh apple juice is on your mind a bit more. There's sophisticated ciders that have many, many flavor layers, and I might describe them to you just using 3 of the ingredients, but there's actually 12 ingredients underneath those 3 that I'm never going to talk about. Or I might just have a cider that's just pineapple, and you're like, sounds great. And you drink it and you're like, that's a pineapple cider, check. And then you're going to carry on your conversation, not talking about cider. You're just going to enjoy the moment, sort of the PBR of, cider, right? So I'm always trying to find, what is that drinking occasion and what piece of my portfolio am I missing? Not from like I got to maximize every cider sale, but like I want to continue to make these new ciders and I want each cider to stand apart from the other ones that are around it and that have come before it and will come after it. So a lot of different
people happy, right? And
I'm trying to
more people happy.
Trying to make myself happy, really, because I like drinking my own cider. So I want to have that cider for that one moment. That being said, there are some ciders that I make that I don't really like. I just said that out loud. I make them for other people. I make them exactly how I want them to taste, but I rarely find myself in a mood for that one. And then there are other ciders that I make that I find myself in the mood to drink a lot. So
Sure. Well, when you make hop cider now, where do you find those hops? And then, is it still the same blend? Still the Amarillo?
Yeah, hop
Cascade?
ciders are a really fascinating piece of cider history in America. The most recent earliest cider that had hops in it was made by Anthem. They were in Salem, Oregon, and I don't exactly remember the story, but they came out with a Anthem hopped cider, and it did very well. This is in 2014 or so, something like that, 13, I made Hoppercott, which was a DuPont Saison. It had the wit beer spices in it as well. So it was a really complex thing. And it was very clearly hops. And there were a number of hop ciders that were coming out in 13, 14, 15, 16. We had a hop cider festival that we put on every year for like 5 or 6 years in a row. And then hop ciders waned, and we no longer make Hoppercott. We pulled it off the market due to declining sales. So I think we've discovered that cider customers don't really want hop. They don't want to think they're drinking hop ciders. They actually want to drink hop ciders because Revival, my classic flagship apple, has mosaic in it. And we don't call that out on the packaging at all. We mention it in the ingredient list. Hops can be an allergen to some folks.
Sure,
we mention the ingredient list.
You're transparent, but it's not a marketing point.
It's an anti. We don't want to tell anybody at all because they won't want it if they think that it has hops in it.
Because that kind of consumer is just thinking hops mean bitterness.
Hops mean bitterness, or hops mean beer, or I don't understand. It's too much information. I just want something simpler. I don't want to think about my choices. Saint Citron, which is the mountain biking cider, that has 4 different kinds of citrus. I love this lie. I'm lying. I'm telling people I'm lying. It has 4 citrus fruits in it. It has lemon, lime, grapefruit, and kumquat. It actually doesn't have grapefruit in it. It has Cascade. And we treat Cascade to throw off all those grapefruit flavor, both a little bit of the bitterness as well as the flavor and aroma on it. So no grapefruit in there, just Cascade hops. So, and we don't advertise that one as a hop cider either because no one would want it. We advertise it as a grapefruit, multiple citrus and grapefruit.
Or you mentioned the flavor of grapefruit,
exactly.
which is there even if it's
clearly in there,
not derived necessarily from
totally. Yeah, it's a small amount. It's not even. It's nowhere near what you would dry hop an IPA. It's about 1/3 of a pound per barrel that we're putting in for that one. So I still continue to use hops, and I go to hops as an ingredient. But from a marketing perspective, I steer away from making it. Not to say that there are no hop cider customers out there. My friend in your state, Brad Page from Colorado Cider Company, he makes a great cider called Grasshopper. It's like AH at the end. Lemongrass and hops. He told me what the hops were one time. CTZ, I can't remember. He's been making forever, and he continues to make it. It sells pretty well. So I don't think there's no market for hop ciders, but it's not one that we continue to be able to find customers for in the Pacific Northwest.
Sure. Well, let's talk about Tepache for a little bit. Yeah. This is something we again, go back to the craft brewing story that Kate wrote on Tepache with Nat. But let's talk about your foray into Tepache.
Continued foray. My career, my Tepache career. So I started making Tepache. Tepache is a traditional Mexican drink made in mostly in the rural parts of Mexico where they grow pineapples. And in Mexico, primarily, it's made using the outer skin of the pineapple. There's very little fermentable sugars in there, but there's a lot of flavor. And then they will, eat or process the meat, the inside of the yellow part of the pineapple elsewhere. So it's a way to make alcohol out of the refuse of the skinning of the pineapples. They'll also add piloncillo sugar, which is this dark brown, unrefined sugar. So it's just a sugar cane that's, sort of like bamboo stalks, crushed and squeezed. And then the juice that comes out is sugarcane juice, like wheatgrass juice, right? But sugarcane juice, super sweet. And then they just slowly evaporate it off. And what's left behind is this crystallized I mean, it's how you make sugar, right? I'm telling you how to make sugar, but a lot of people don't even understand the concept of how you make sugar. This is just like a natural product, right? It's only when it becomes heavily bleached and refined does it become table sugar. Piloncillo is just this very dark brown, and it's called piloncillo because it's in these little cones, little pylon, and that's how it's typically manufactured. The little cones, like little muffin tins in Mexico, and it's very, very common. And a lot of Latin American countries make their own version. Panela is another name for very similar product. So the traditional recipe for tepache in Mexico is pineapple skins and piloncillo and maybe some cinnamon and some water, and you can imagine the fermentation from there. It just ferments the sugar, the pineapple adds some flavor. It's usually consumed fresh, like 3 days fresh. So you get some alcohol, lightly alcoholic, still sweet as well. We don't use the skins. We use the whole pineapple. Tepache is a bit like American pie or apple pie in America. There's general rules, but everybody makes their own. You put crust on it?
Sure.
I don't put the top on. You make a lattice top? No, I put cinnamon? No, I don't. I put cheese on. Whatever. So there's a lot of flexibility in tepache without quote unquote breaking the rules or whatever. So we use the whole pineapple, which is pretty unusual, but it brings a ton more pineapple flavor than I think some of the traditional Mexican tepaches do. We also add some cinnamon and cloves and allspice, which is fairly common in the tepache recipe. The process is hard to do, and I would recommend that subscribers, go check out the archive because it's a pain in the butt to make on a commercial scale. It's really easy to make on a home scale as long as you get the timing right, because you're drinking a partially fermented product. So you have the pineapples, you wait till it starts to bubble, you're tasting it. Pineapples, interestingly, have about 6% potential alcohol, 7% potential alcohol in them. So if you're, if you're still tasting some sweetness, but there's been some active fermentation, well, maybe you're in the 2 or 3 or 4% range. So it's not really going to get weirdly alcoholic on you. Fairly easy to do on a home scale. And maybe you put some of the spices in during the beginning of the fermentation. We actually make a tea out of those spices, take whole spices and simmer it with water, and then we have this tea which we can pour in at the end to the right amount. It's tepache in Mexico is traditionally, again, it's tradition. Anybody can do what they want. Oftentimes mixed with beer. Sometimes they'll pour some beer in to start the fermentation. You don't need to because there's so much yeast on the outside of a pineapple. It's going to go by itself. So it's fairly common to have the sort of beer influence in tepache. And I, of course, latched onto that piece of the legend of tepache pretty strongly. And right away, I started making tepaches that were designed to be blended with beer. And so when tepache was first released, and every year we make it, on the side of the bottle, it says how to drink tepache. Mix 1 bottle of tepache with 2 bottles of beer. And beer options include light lagers, Hefeweizens, dark beers. I like to say that tepache makes every beer taste better. First time I ever had Sam Adams Utopias was with tepache. First time I ever had Dark Lord was with tepache. West Veteran 12 with tepache. So we did an event every year called Night of 1,000 Tepaches, where we would blend tepache at a time with beer from local breweries. I'd partner with a bunch of the local breweries, a dozen or 20 local breweries, and find their favorite beer to blend with tepache. And the varieties, Widmer did one, raspberry Belgian quad one time. Ruse Brewing did Britannomyces a wild ale with peach. The classic, crowd favorite is like a smoked Helles. Goes great. So tepache is so versatile.
Absolutely see that work.
It's incredible. It goes really well with everything. It doesn't go great with really piney, dank IPAs. I don't love it with piney, dank IPAs. So we do this event every year, and people would bring their whales into the event to open up, and the humor of opening this super rare beer and then bastardizing it by blending it with tepache. And you drink Dark Lord, you're like, that's a good beer. It tastes better with tepache.
You're here to tepachify the
Yeah.
beer world. No, that's cool. Well, so it's a spontaneously then, or I shouldn't say spontaneously fermented, I should say, fermented with naturally occurring yeast.
Unwashed pineapples. That's kind of the key for us for sure. Yeah, you could pitch a yeast, but there's really no reason to. Every time we make tepache, there is a bit of chance to it. We use unwashed pineapples. The way what we buy the pineapples is that the green spiky bit has been left behind in the field, so we just get the tepache ball, so to speak. But there's no reason you can't just go to the store and buy a bunch of pineapples, chop the green thing off, grind them all up, and go from there, as you can read about in the recipe. So it's really pretty versatile about how you do it, and it'll always kick off an alcoholic fermentation, but it may very well kick off and other kinds of undesirable fermentations as well. So that like 3, 4, 5 day window is really important, where you can drink it before it finishes fermenting, and then other bad things can happen to it. An active fermentation is like safer to drink if you're not sure what's going on than one that's sat for a while.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Well, we've been talking for an hour now. I do want to talk to you about, maybe, the recent move, this decision that you've made, that you and the board for the company have made to wind down operations.
Yeah, to call it quits after 12 great years.
12 years of pushing the envelope in cider and bringing flavor here.
Yeah.
Talk to me about what took you all down that road. What were some of the moments of realization? I mean, I think that, if in every business, there are always struggles and there are always things that you push through, and then there are those moments where you're like, okay, maybe things are changing to a point where I have to make a different decision, and that my sheer optimism isn't going to be the thing that carries me through this. Yeah. Talk to me about that decision-making process and what some of those factors were that kind of that changed the look of reality for you.
Yeah. Well, I think you said it. You go into owning a business, starting a business with a lot of optimism, and you're maybe jumping on particular market trends or other opportunities in the broader market that you think this now is the time. And we definitely did that. I think I frequently say that the best time and place to start a cider company in the history of the world is Portland, 2011. That's when we started. There was enough cider education about cider already done by some of the earliest pioneers. Some of those folks couldn't survive and went out of business by the time 2011 rolled around. But there was enough knowledge about cider as a base to let me use that. And I wasn't trying to create a new category. Everybody had already had cider. Most of us got drunk on it in college and didn't like the experience, but there was also already some level of knowledge. There was no Angry Orchard when I started Reverend Nat's. So we didn't have a category leader. The category leader was Woodchuck, but it was a weak category leader, and it was way the hell over there in Vermont. It was kind of a regional thing in some ways. So it was really an opportunity, to jump on it. And at the time I was doing computer programming, program software management, and I was 13 years in that career and ready for a change. And yeah, I mean, it was just, I told you the story, sitting around the table with my friends, and I was just like, God damn it, I'm going to do it. And I didn't really know at the time that was the best time and place to start, but it became pretty obvious pretty quickly. The reception that I got in Portland, the embrace that I got from the Portland brewer community was, instantaneous and very welcoming. I remember my carb stone fell apart. I was making packaging cider in my garage, and my carb stone fell apart. And I, texted a local brewery owner, and I was like, "Hey man, can I borrow a carb stone?" And he's like, "Yeah, come over." And I did. And then I remember I asked Breakside for a piece of hose. I broke a hose, and he was like, "Come on down." And I think being the cider guy in a beer, the beer knowledgeable cider guy in a beer town really helped me, because I made friends with all the brewers, and none of them saw me as competition. So very, very rapidly, I was able to get Reverend Nat's into every tap room in Portland. It was extremely common to find Reverend Nat's in any brewery, because it's very familiar to the brewers. I got the privilege of being invited to the first Oregon Brewers Festival to have cider in it. It had been around for 20 something years before they invited cider. And the first year, there's only one cider, and it was mine. And we sold more kegs of cider than any beer that year. which is, it's fun to say that, but it's really just reflective of the fact that they should have done it earlier.
There's a whole bunch of beers.
There's
just one cider.
You could put dog poop on this and it'd be like, oh, you sold more dog poop than anything else because it's just different, right? So, but being able to embrace that was really important to me. And
it's why the blueberry wheat beer sells more than,
because it's different.
It's the only fruit
else.
beer on a brewery's lineup. It's gonna. I've got 6 IPAs. They're all gonna balkanize that clientele.
So, but I also had not just the default welcome reception, but like an honest welcome reception. Like I remember at my opening party for the tap room in early 2013, Mike Wright, the founder of Commons Brewery, came. Alan Sprints, the founder of Hair of the Dog, came to my opening party, and that felt like, oh man, like I'm here. Very early on, Jeff Alworth, Beervana blog, he listed Reverend Nat's as one of the best breweries in Portland. He does this annual best breweries list, and he listed us as one of the best breweries, which was like top honor for me. I've always said that I'm a brewer who makes cider, and I thought I was that, and I think that was the reception that I got. So those early years were extremely rewarding to me. And we really started...
And it was that same energy that was driving the development of craft beer.
Absolutely.
2012, 2013.
We were right there with them.
2016.
It's crazy, right? Yeah. So I was definitely capitalizing on that broader trend as well. And cider was growing as incredibly well at that point too. We were at 30% growth year over year at that point. So I was riding 2 different waves and really enjoying them. And then, as we get bigger, as we get into, multiple states, and, I had 29 employees at the peak. There's the American dream of grow, and the capitalism. I got investors who were putting their capital in, expecting that capital to come back out. And it didn't work out in a lot of ways. COVID was really tough on us. The changing distributor landscape was really tough on us. We had a distributor that was in the craft space, and now they're really not in the craft space. And we unfortunately had to suffer that transition with them. Our tap room had to close in the beginning of COVID. We moved to this much larger facility that was never fully realized as well. So we put a ton of money into it and then couldn't actually use it. So there wasn't one reason why we made the decision. But I mean, you said it. It's like the business. Any business is constant struggle every day or every week. And if you aren't the kind of operator who likes challenge and likes new things and likes solving problems, you'll quit earlier than somebody who does like solving problems. And that's really my favorite part of running this business has been a constant newness, and whatever is gets thrown at me, I really enjoy, or wherever, not just reactive, but also proactive, like looking out and saying, oh, here's something that we can go do that can help us. Let's go attack that area, whatever the topic is. And, you can only do that for so long before you either get a little complacent and stop going big when you could go big, or the market really conspires against you. One big thing is that we used to sell about 60% of our cider in Oregon and 40% in other states. California was a huge market for us. We, at one point, were sold in 13 US states. And I like to say that we were like the icing on the cake of a local cider. So North Carolina, great example. We sold a lot of cider in North Carolina. They had a pretty good local cider scene. They were the cake. And we would come in and be the icing on top. So somebody says, oh, I like cider. I've had the local stuff. What's next? Oh, Reverend Nat's. You should try. Oh, it's from Portland. Okay, I'll give it a try. Delicious. And they would enjoy some Reverend Nat's. But as the cider market continues to mature, North Carolina comes up with their own icing. They got their own unique specialty cider company out there that's that's the next more advanced level cider for an advanced level drinker. So our out of state business has declined tremendously since COVID, and COVID, encouraged consumers to buy local as well. I'm happy for that. So there's a bit of a natural course, I think, that the business ran over the last 12 years, and arguably maybe the course ran over the last 10 years, and we've just sort of been. Maybe I've been mountain biking too much in the last 2 years, but it's a very natural progression. I'm definitely not sad at all for where we find ourselves now. It has been an incredible run. We've done some incredible things there. I was just talking to one of my cider makers who was with me in some of the early days, and he said that he felt like every week we were doing something that nobody else has ever done. And I was like, yeah, dude, we invented things that other cider companies now have built their entire company around. One of my old bar managers was like, hey, you remember making this and this? And I was like, man, I've forgotten more ciders than most cider companies will ever make. We just made so many ciders. We've probably made close to 10,000 ciders in the last 10 years. Collaborations out the wazoo. We used to make a new cider every single week for the tap room for 10 years. There's a lot of numbers right there. We'd do these events where we would have 40 or 50 new ciders for an event. We made so much, and I'm really proud of the team we put together and the work that we did. And I guess supposedly the quote unquote legacy that we leave behind as well, because in the last couple of weeks since I've announced this, there are cideries from all around the world that I didn't know they existed. Sorry, guys, who are saying that I was a major inspiration for them to open up their business. So that's great. I got a ton of help from the local beer community when I started up, and to be able to know that other people are kind of realizing their dream as well because of some information that I was able to share it's a good full circle. And it's a great opportunity for me to be like, all right, now it's time for somebody else to, be the inspirer while I go do other things.
Is there anything you regret about it?
Yeah, a little bit. Things I could have done better. Actually, I think the most important thing is in the last couple of years, we all had our own unique pandemic experience, right? And mine was about, the big one for me was realizing that today is the most important day, and this week is the most important week, and this month is the most important month. And prior to 2020, I was continually looking at, if we can get to point X, then everything will be better. Or if we can just get to this other place in our business, then things will start to improve in this other part of our business. And 2020 taught me that that's not, I decided that wasn't how I wanted to run the business. Every day mattered, and every day mattered more than any other day ever. And that was really fantastic because I started to develop relationships with the community. We started to donate a ton of product and do a ton of fundraisers for marginalized communities, BIPOCs, and LGBTQ. And we've got a huge following now. I have a huge amount of customers who don't drink cider, but they drink Reverend Nats. Don't drink alcohol, but they drink Reverend Nats. And that's fantastic. I think I'm a little bit disappointed that there aren't more businesses who are willing to stick their necks out. We stuck our necks out a lot in 2020 during the protests, and it really came back to reward us in many, many ways. And so I think my only regret is that it took me a bunch of years of purely focused on cider and growth and spreadsheets before I, opened up my eyes to a bigger picture around me. And if I could do it all over again, I would have. That's the only thing I would change, is I'd be far more community focused, from the very beginning, and focused on, this day, this week, treating my employees better, paying them better. I've learned a lot in the last few years for sure, and I wish I could have done that earlier.
Sure. All right, what were the straws that you hit this year that broke the camel's back? Obviously, there's all sorts of things, and it's always a multitude of reasons. When you really decide to, but is it this need for some investment to try to hit growth numbers, or just watching this pressure, or is this some sort of feeling like you also need to do something else? The other option obviously would be to sell the business. Yeah. But it's a little hard for you to do that since it's called Reverend Nat.
You're not going to buy it unless I'm coming along with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think the one straw was, I was actually coming back from a big road trip. I was in Colorado. My kid just moved to rural southern Colorado, and I had 3 days of driving interspersed with some mountain biking on the way back. And I was by myself, and there's a lot of thinking time. And I have been, my wife and I have been talking about quitting Reverend Nat's since the beginning, really. Every year there's some moment where we're like, maybe this was the time. So it was just another one of those normal opportunities to think about, what we're doing with the business. And at that moment, at that occurrence of that feeling, I was like, oh yeah, this is it. And I think that the straw was really that there is no straw right now. And every other time I've been faced with this existential decision of yes business, no business, there was an outside factor saying you need money, or you're not going to make payroll, or your lease is ending, or you need your distributors, some other factor that I could work and struggle and figure out and get a way through. And right now, there's nothing wrong with the business. Of course, there's tons of things wrong, but there's no one thing that's like an outside influence.
You're not responding.
I'm not responding.
It's not reactionary.
Right. So this was an opportunity for me. I could look and say, wait a minute, if I take the next 6 weeks to shut down the business, that will be good. No problem making payroll. We've got enough inventory to last. I've got some great final releases I want to make. And it really gets us, you're not closing down at the end of a winter where winters are tough on everybody, right? We're closing down at the end of the summer where things are a little more positive. So the more I started to think about it, the more I realized, this could not be a better time. And I can't imagine there being a better time in the future. So that was really like the opposite of a straw, really. It was the lack of straws that really made me sure that this was the right time.
The question always arises when you do this, and close a business down, that was it ever really worth doing? Mm-hmm. We have this idea of success in America, mm-hmm. that success is growing something, growing, selling, mm-hmm. making your millions and millions of dollars, and then retiring on a beach somewhere, right? Like that's the American dream, which is a little different than, say, the European business dream, which is generally, taking over the family business, or starting a family business and handing it down to your kids, and keeping this, this legacy. But there's always, no matter where you are, there's always this idea of it succeeding and living past you. We all strive for this kind of, to expand beyond the limited time of our lives, and to be more impactful over more generations. Like, how do we find this kind of posthumous grandeur? For you, how do you square that up? I mean, shutting the business down means this is the end of this legacy. Right.
Yeah, I think there's I have two sort of things I think about with regard to that, question of, ongoing legacy. One is, a number of years ago, I was facing yet another existential crisis in the business. And I reached out to this guy, a local person who does coaching and mentoring for startup, primary technology software startups and founders. And he said that he encourages all his founders to consider their startup an experiment. They're seeing if this idea that they have will work. And I took that two ways. One of, Reverend Nat's didn't really work because here we are. But then I flipped it around and said, Reverend Nat's really, really, really worked. The experiment was a success. On year 2, we sat down and did like a branding and mission statement and everything. I got all the lead actors in the business together, and we came up with this mission statement that Reverend Nat is here to change the perspective of cider in the United States, primarily among craft beer drinkers. That was the mission of the company. And the way we accomplished it was making unusual ciders. And we did that. Like, if you talk to the response I'm getting from social media is like, cider makers all around the world and breweries all around the world, like, hey, you did your huge impact, and cider is so much different now because you've been involved in it. And so that's really like affirmation that it was definitely an experiment that can be over now, and can be over with a level of success and a level of accomplishment that I would have been really excited about. If somebody's lined me up for it 12 years ago. And 12 years ago, if somebody said, here is how the business is going to look, and in 12 years, you're going to end like this, sitting here talking to Jamie, would you like to do this business? And I would say, hell yeah, sign me up, because it has been a job for sure, but it has been far and away the best job I've ever had. And I can't imagine having a better job. It's been terrible at times, absolutely terrible. But on balance, it's been by far the best job I've ever had.
What are you going to do next?
I have no idea. I'm going mountain biking next week. I don't know. I decided on that drive back from Colorado, I decided that I would approach the closure of Reverend Nat's with the same level of intention and passion that I've approached every other aspect of the business. So it's been really important to me to make sure that I'm, closing out my relationship with my vendors and my customers and my distributors with a lot of work, and making sure that everybody gets, gets mentioned, gets talked about. We're resolved everything, and so that's really been my focus. I haven't thought about really what's come next. I gotta go get another job because now I don't have any income. I'm gonna be unemployed, which is cool. So I don't have, it's not to be 6 months in Mexico for sure. But I don't really know. I am, since we're on an industry podcast here, I do have natwestbev.com. That the part of me that has spent a long time helping other people, other beverage producers, is still really passionate and really enthusiastic. I think more than it's ever been. So I've got a couple of folks I'm already interested in helping. One cider customer, one non-alcoholic fermented ginger soda customer. So if you've got a beverage, and I've helped people with kombuchas and hard coffees and not hard coffee, cold brews, and you name it. I've done a ton of different beverage projects. So I'm certainly motivated and very interested to hear what other people have got going on and seeing if there's, I remember the first time I tried to get a barcode, that took me like days and days and days to figure out what the hell is up with barcodes? Like, who figures out you figure it out, and now it's like, I can tell you how to get a barcode in 10 seconds. So that level of knowledge shouldn't be trapped inside one person. It shouldn't go to the grave with me. I got to be able to help out some other people.
There are many, many Tepache collaborations left to come.
Yeah, bring it on.
All right, well, I think this isn't the last we've heard from Nat West, and I think this is a great place to bring it to a close. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and reliability with 24/7 service and support. Try Firm Cap Eco from Carry, available through BSG. Try Old Orchard's flavored craft juice concentrate blends in your next craft beverage. AccuBrew helps you detect problems before they ruin a batch. ProBrew has rotary can fillers in stock with a 2 to 4 week lead time. Omega's thiolized yeasts bring intense guava and passion fruit aromas out of your Malden hops. Go green with multi-pack handles from Robert's Polypro. And ABS Commercial is your full-service brewery outfitter. Of course, if you've enjoyed this episode and any others, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button if you haven't already. And of course, subscribers can go dig into our archives and see Kate's article on Tepache that she wrote with Nat, a recipe for making your own Tepache.
It's delicious.
And you can add it to everything from smoked Helles to barrel-aged Imperial Stout. Mm-hmm. It's good anywhere. We already mentioned do a little bit of you plan to do some more consulting in the future, and I think that's probably the best way. Go find that Reverend Nat's out on your shelves, especially if you're in a state that currently sells it.
Yeah, there are some still on the shelves. Get it before it's gone.
Nat, I appreciate you sharing with us and doing it so openly.
Thanks a lot for the time.
With that kind of vulnerability. It's always a hard thing to talk about these things, but you've got an amazing attitude.
I'm happy to share.
To go in it with. I hope we get to ride some mountain bikes again sometime soon.
We will.
Whatever time you find yourself with. Come out and visit me in Colorado sometime.
Great. See you there.
Yeah. Cheers. This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.